we will begin. Good morning, everyone. So welcome to the second installment in what we call our Global Conversations. And this is a lecture series which forms a part of our campus's, our university's 75th anniversary celebrations. This morning, we will be hearing from Mr. Sanjeev Gupta, who will speak on cultural intelligence. Mr. Sanjeev Gupta is a board member and executive director for financial services at Africa Finance Corporation. He is responsible for treasury, trade finance, syndication, country relations, and advisory lines of business within the FAC. Mr. Gupta has over 30 years experience in investment management, private equity, and corporation finance. His forte has been to blend together global and indigenous corporates, financial investors, and governments to develop commercially viable businesses and development models that leave a sustainable impact on emerging economies. Prior to joining AFC, Mr. Gupta was the managing partner of Emerging Markets Mergers and Acquisitions Center of Excellence at the Ernst & Young. He has also been the Chief Executive Officer of Sanlam Investment Management Emerging Markets Operations and a founding and managing partner of Emerging Opportunity Consulting, a boutique advisory firm specializing in SME financing. Mr. Gupta holds a bachelor's degree from the University of Calcutta, India, and is an alumnus of the Said Business School, University of Oxford, England, and also an alumnus of the MIT Sloan School of Management. He is a fellow of the Institute of Chartered Accountants, India. Sanjeev is a board member at various charitable and not-for-profit organizations globally. He is a member of the Institute of Directors, United Kingdom, guest lecturer at various universities, example, UCLA, Anderson School of Management, University of Amsterdam Business School, India Institute of Management, Shillong, India, Murdoch University, Virginia Military Institute, Dubai, and now the UWI Open Campus. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Sanjeev Gupta.
Wow. Thank you, Althea, and thanks for the opportunity. I must confess that this is the first time that I've had the opportunity to speak to audience from the Caribbean. I was born in India and grew up there, and in my younger days, my memory of the West Indies was always about being thrashed in cricket by the West Indians. So I grew up marveling at the cricketing talent of West Indies in the 70s and 80s and how India would never, ever be able to beat them. Mm-hmm. So to me, it's really a very heartwarming experience this morning to be able to talk to people who it's really my memory of the younger days of cricket that has in the past made me think of the Caribbean. So thank you again. And, obviously, I think I was saying to you all that I would have personally liked to have been there and met people and be able to speak in person, because it's always more fun. And it would have given me an excuse to be in the Caribbean. I've never been in that part of the world.
Okay.
So I hope I'll be able to do that. But the reason I was highlighting it also is because, when one speaks virtually, as I'm going to be doing today, it's difficult to gauge the interest and the attention from the audience. You're and right. It's also difficult for me to make sure whether I am, striking the right chords so that it becomes an interactive experience as opposed to just another boring lecture.
Right.
Because, I just want your audience to appreciate, Althea, that I'm not a professor or a researcher or an academic. I'm a business person. I go around the world looking for business opportunities and doing transactions. So a lot of what I'll say or what I will share is really my personal experiences and the lessons that I have derived from it, which I hope is of some relevance and use to your students and to your audience. Okay.
I am sure.
So just to sort of start off with putting some context to the discussion today, I just want you. Is everybody there? Okay.
Yes, we are hearing you very well.
Okay.
The
Yeah,
virtual space is one that gives this kind of silence, but we're here. I'm hearing you
Okay.
quite well.
Okay, wonderful. No, so just to give a little bit of a flavor to your audience and to the students about myself, and thanks for that introduction about what I do and what I've done. But just to sort of highlight a few things about my personal life and how that brings me to share what I'm going to be sharing. So, as I said, I was born in India in the late 60s. I grew up in India. For the first 23 years of my life, I had not traveled outside India. I had probably not even traveled outside my home city, which was Calcutta. And therefore, to a very large extent, and this is an important point, to a very, very large extent, my exposure to the world, my understanding of the world, my relationship with the world was very, very narrow, right? Very narrow, very shallow. And also, these were the days when there was no internet, remember, there was no Google, there was no social media. So a lot of my learnings or my education was based on the school I went to, the parents that I had, and some of the family who were enlightened enough to inspire me, right? So to a large extent, that first 23 years of my life, I focused on what most Indian kids did those days, which is to study and study hard, to get a degree that would get you a job. And the India of the 80s, which is when I graduated, wasn't quite the India of today, right? India of the 80s was a very depressing place, if I may say so. It was a very dark place in some ways. And it was certainly not a place where one could be adventurous or one could be aggressive in one's ambitions. It was a place where very few jobs were available, and education was a passport to getting those jobs. And there was a rush. There was always a rush and a pressure and a stress level to be at the top. Because if you did not academically achieve a certain level, you would not get a job that would give you the kind of lifestyle that would make you comfortable. I'm not even talking of luxury. I'm talking of comfort. So that's the India I grew up in. And then I left. I left India when I was 23, and I went to a country called Botswana. Now, I'll admit to you that at that point in time, when I was asked to go and do a job in Botswana, I didn't know where Botswana was. Okay, I was working for Price Waterhouse, the accounting firm those days. I was doing my articles. I was finishing my chartered accountancy, and they said, "We're going to send you to Botswana for 6 months." And I asked the partner in concern that, "Where is Botswana?" And he said, "Good question. I also don't know." Except that we think we have an office there and they need some people. So that's how I landed in Botswana. And that was perhaps one of the most seminal moments in my life, because everything that I'm today and every work that I have managed to do and enjoy probably started there. Because Botswana in the early 90s, this was 1991 when I went there, was a small country. It still is. But a very prosperous country, which still is. And to that extent, my baptism into the African continent was very, very pleasant. I did not end up going to one of the more, let's call it, tougher parts of the continent. I ended up going to one of the softer parts of the continent. But more importantly, Botswana at that time, being the prosperous country that it was seen as a poster child, as an example of what could be achieved on the African continent. And this was the 90s. And the 90s is an important period in the history of, of our world, because 89 was when the Cold War ended, right? 1989 was when the Cold War ended. And a lot of the proxy wars, a lot of the Cold War related conflicts that had plagued and affected the African continent was disappearing, right? And a lot of the African countries were either becoming independent, or had become independent some time back, but were beginning to create a different economic model for itself. It became a region where youngsters like me had huge opportunities to work and be part of that evolution. So between 1991 and 2000, the next 10 years of my life, I ended up working across Africa as a young man out of India with a fairly good education, but with a fairly limited exposure to the world. And I learned a few things during that time. And that is pretty much what made me get interested in this whole aspect of culture, this whole aspect of managing diversity, the whole aspect of learning that if things are different, if people are different, it is not a reason for you to be indifferent, right? It is a reason for you then to become more curious, more inquisitive, more, let's call it, interested in understanding the differences. And I think because I was a youngster out of India into an African continent, which was evolving from a very, very difficult past, there were no real rules to follow. There was no real guidance to receive. It was very much about thinking on your feet, making people trust you, believing in people, and making things happen together based on what I've subsequently learned is a very basic human thing, and that is human interaction. Because we didn't have laws to protect us, we didn't have institutions to guide us, and we certainly didn't have frameworks to enforce certain decisions. So it was based on human interaction. So let me therefore, bring it all back to sort of base, as the Americans like to call it, and say that what does this mean? What it means is that this whole issue of cultural intelligence, as I call it, is essentially nothing but a very intuitive and a very obvious part of how we should be dealing with the challenges that we face, whether it's in our personal lives or whether it's in our professional life. Because if I can just take a pause for a moment and just highlight the fact that in today's world, we do have certain complexities that was not always the case, then we will probably be able to accept why the need to be culturally intelligent is no longer a choice, but it's almost mandatory. And the 5 or 6 things that I'll highlight are obvious ones. I think the first thing that we all must remember is that unlike as recent as 25 years back, as recent as that, the sheer interconnectivity of the world today is huge, right? What happens in one part of the world affects another part of the world very quickly. What happens in one part of the world is transmitted as news to another part of the world very quickly, right? Even our own supply chains around which we get our basic food and commodities and services depends on what happens to another part of the world. It wasn't always the case. This is what I'm trying to highlight. We also must understand that human beings in general, because of social media, maybe because of the connectivity of the world that is currently there, have become much more global. Their expectations in terms of the goods and the services they get is very global. You cannot stifle them, you cannot compel them, and you cannot certainly ignore them in terms of their demand. You have to find ways of providing that service they demand, or else they will go and get it from elsewhere. Because the choices that an average consumer has today, because of the sheer interconnectivity of the world, is humongous. It's humongous, right? One of the sort of examples that I like to provide to buttress this point of the sheer vociferousness of consumer demand is that, for those of you who know India, will know that one of the most traditional and one of the most popular clothing is the sari, right? The Indian women wear a sari.
Mhm.
Now, there's this company, the French company Hermes, who went to India a couple of decades back, thinking that India is a big market, large number of people, good consumption or purchasing power. So they went with their products. What were their products? The prestige, scarves, skirts, stuff that they were very known for. And very quickly they realized that they did not have what the Indians really wanted. They did not have the products that Indians would buy. This is a company that overnight, therefore, changed their product line from doing what they had historically done to start making saris. I don't know whether you guys know, anybody knows that Hermes actually started making saris in India, right? Because they realized that is the product that they can sell to the Indians. And what that meant, whether you realize or not, is suddenly a product company, which is what Hermes was. They sold certain products. Involuntarily, or voluntarily in this case, became no longer a product company, but a promise company. The promise of what? Promise of quality, promise of a good brand, promise of an extravagance that the brand Hermes brings. So they moved away from being a product company to becoming a promise company that I will deliver what you need. Don't worry about what I sell. Tell me what you need and I'll produce it. So this is a great example, in my view, of how global companies are having to change their approaches because they realize that what they believe is appropriate for the consumer is not universally accepted as the demand from the consumer's side. So if I kind of sort of bring it to some sort of a concluding sort of framework in terms of how I want this dialogue to therefore go forward, the points I'm laying across to you guys on the table is that if we were to examine ourselves and understand our own intuitive logic, then we would immediately realize that there is something called our emotional mind, or the emotional intelligence mind, and then there is our IQ mind, which is our intelligence quotient. So there is an emotion in us, and then there is the intelligence quotient. So in many ways, the cultural intelligence quotient, the one that I'm trying to describe, is really a combination of those two, the IQ side of you and the EQ side of you, but with an addition of a greater degree of awareness that what you know is not necessarily what needs or what is known. So firstly, you must understand that what you know is not what is necessarily known. Secondly, what you think is not necessarily how people think. And what you sometimes see as indifference or aggression or resistance or resentment is often coming from lack of education, ignorance, and very often cultural traditions coming in the way. So for global leaders, which is something I do in my own business, particularly the younger ones, I keep telling them that the way to handle opportunities, the way to handle crisis, and the way to handle interpersonal rivalries is to try and see things from the other person's point of view. Easier said than done. Why easier said than done? Simply because we do not, as human beings, we are not conditioned enough to try and understand the other person's point of view, because that's not how we are educated usually. That's not how we are what you call emboldened. So when we study, when we grow up, when we live in the families and the cultures that we grow up in, we live in echo chambers. We live in an environment which gives us approbation, approval, recognition based on the rules and the traditions of our environment. So when we go out of that environment into a different environment, we bring our own conditioning into it and fail to understand that your realities are different to another person's realities. I'm right now in Washington, D.C., in fact, in a hotel room as I'm speaking to you. And it was just brought to bear when I was having a meeting with a very senior White House official yesterday morning, where this particular official, in their own way of looking at the world, was essentially telling me how the US has this huge agenda to engage with the African continent, and how institutions like the ones that I work for are the ideal partnership platforms for them to work with. So music to my ears, right? I felt very good. I felt very happy. Then the conversation moved towards the conditions and the terms under which the US government and its various departments would engage and invest and partner us. And one of the things that came out was Chinese content, right? Now, as you know, as some of you know, if not all, that there is this huge global agenda around the idea that the sheer over-dependence on China for basic goods and materials must stop. There is also a big global agenda around what is seen to be China's aggression and China's desire to dominate geopolitics. Now, these are perceptions, remember, because what the Americans think here, the Chinese also think on the other side, right? So somewhere in between this conversation yesterday morning, this gentleman, this very, very senior White House official, said to me that, however, you will be discouraged. We cannot stop you, but you will be discouraged from working with Chinese contractors and Chinese banks and Chinese money. And I stayed silent. And then, in my own intuitive way, because remember, it's a challenge that I never thought I would have to face. In my own intuitive way, I looked at this gentleman and I said, are you serious? Are you actually telling me that I cannot buy or use anything from China when the whole world is still doing it? Are you telling me that if I'm going to build solar power stations in Africa, I've got to get solar panels from outside of China, when 90% of the solar panels of the world is made in China? And by the way, sir, are you telling me that I cannot take money from China, but you can? So he said, what does that mean? I said, well, all your bonds are bought by the Chinese. So essentially, you are funded by the Chinese, sir, right? So I'm just giving this to you as a very real life example that happened 24 hours back, of how highly educated people, highly experienced people, highly ambitious people make the basic mistake of trying to make rules, regulations, or create expectations that cannot be executed upon or implemented, because the realities are not there, are different. So again, I go back to this issue of cultural intelligence, that it's about this acute form of awareness and the acute form of understanding that you need to create as to why is something the way it is before you judge whether it's right or wrong, or before you decide what needs to change about it. Because I can only tell you one thing. And again, this is personal information, I mean, personal experience I'm sharing. My job is such that today I normally do roughly 2 to 3 cities a week. That's the amount I travel, right? I travel a lot between the Middle East, Africa, Asia, including Japan and China, a lot in the US, and a lot in Europe. That's my travel beat. The only region I don't go to much is South America and Australia. Otherwise, on any given week, I am in at least 2 or 3 cities around these global regions. And all I can tell you is that in all my travels, if I've understood one thing, that is that people ultimately and fundamentally want the same thing, which is peace, prosperity, security, and hope. So if you can link up with those emotions, you will always have winning partnerships as opposed to confrontational relationships. I'll stop here now because I had promised that I will not speak for more than 20, 25 minutes. I'll just set the flavor. I hope I've set the flavor. As I said, I feel a little disadvantaged not being able to see all of you. And I purposely did not want to take you through PowerPoint slides because that can take the personal aspect of what I wanted to share away. But I'm happy to get into an interactive dialogue and handle questions and have a conversation. Thank you, Althea.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Sanjeev. This is wonderful. Before I say anything further, do we have any questions from our audience? So we will do this by show of hands. You use your reaction button to show hands, and I will acknowledge you and you ask your questions. Anyone? I know we have persons on Facebook Live as well, but I'm inviting persons in Zoom if they have any questions.
Registrar, moderator, chairman.
Yes,
This is
bro.
Julie Meeks. This is Julie Meeks. Thank you. Thanks so much to Sanjeev for that, that little talk. I wanted to know what he would recommend as coming next. So you try to put yourself into thinking about where the person is coming from. So you're understanding, but remembering that you come from a different space and perspective. What do you do next? Even if you're understanding, how do you parlay that into a behavior that is a mutual win-win, a mutual benefit? I sometimes can understand. So I understand where this American is coming from in saying, you know, he doesn't want to take Chinese money. What do you do next? Thank you.
Thank you, Prof.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, can I answer this question before I take the next one?
Yes,
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, so obviously, you know, Julie, it's not just a question from your side. It's almost a commentary, I think, on the world that we live in. And I think one of the things that we will do well to remember in many ways is that if there has been one significant sort of shift that is here to stay in this particular world of ours, it's the fact that the influence of the big state or the influence of governments and the role of geopolitics as the basis for business decisions is huge now. I mean, what I'm really trying to say is that there was a time when business decisions economic decisions, financial decisions influenced geopolitics. But it's right now the other way around, where geopolitics is determining what business to do with whom and how. Okay, so in this current time, therefore, your comment is actually quite critical, that it's okay, we understand each other, or we're trying to understand each other, and there's no limit to understanding. Those of us who are married know that after 40 years, you're still trying to understand each other sometimes. So understanding is a process, it's not a destination. So the question, therefore, was, what do we do with this understanding, and how do we create commonality around that understanding? And I think my answer to that would be, Julie, that if you fundamentally believe that human beings only collaborate and cooperate between each other if they trust each other, then that's the one thing that you will be able to generate if you try and understand each other, because trying to understanding creates trust. If you also fundamentally believe, which I do, that human beings usually react to three sentiments or three emotions. One is greed, the other is fear, and the other is guilt. Okay. So again, if you're going to be a successful businessman, which is what I try to be, I try and create an understanding of cultures, traditions, and people on the other side, with the view to assess their level of fear, their level of greed, and their level of guilt. Wow. Because once I do that, I find it a very easy way, usually. Like, for example, the American example I gave yesterday, I think I touched on his fear of the Chinese, but I also touched on his greed to be more self-sufficient than he currently is. And I managed to highlight to him the reality of his own situation. So the point I'm trying to make, Julie, is that understanding is a process. And by understanding, you got to somehow make sure that these basic human motivational aspects, which is, as I said, fear, greed, and guilt, how can they be used to your advantage? And lastly, by understanding each other, how do you create trust between yourselves? Because trust is such an intangible concept, but such a potent concept and such a overpowering concept, that trust has to come from understanding. So that's how I would answer your question.
Thank you. That is interesting. Fear, greed, and guilt as motivators. Our second question, I saw Stephen Gordon with his hand up. Stephen, do you have a question or comment?
Actually had a comment. Okay. I just wanted to understand better the confluence of emotional intelligence and IQ and cultural intelligence. Because I agree with that 100%.
Okay.
I agree with what the speaker said in that regard. So I just wanted for him to comment a little bit more on that still, because I think I think a lot of emphasis isn't placed on emotional and cultural intelligence in terms of relationships with people.
Yeah.
Just from an interpersonal, but also from a national standpoint, I don't think enough emphasis placed like on cultural intelligence. Especially in light of like the colonial era still, and where we are today, and what we're trying to forge forward in terms of global identity. So that's just really something I would like for him to expound upon if he could.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely.
Let me try and dabble into this, okay? Because I'm not sure, again, whether I'll be able to give a sort of a solution or a formula to what the point was. But I think if I may go back to the first principles of how I started my speaking, which is that, I'm not a researcher, I'm not a professor, I'm just a practitioner, and I do transactions, which means I have to deal with people, and to deal with people, I have to spend the time and effort to understand them, and I have to see what makes them tick. So that's what I am, right? I'm very, very focused about that. I'm outcome-based, but for my outcomes to happen, I know there is a process, and a large part of that process is understanding and working with people. So since that's the work I do, I kind of look at it this way, that historically, and probably even today in our academic world or in our own sort of, rearing our own kids and being role models for them kind of world, the emotional intelligence part is often looked at and dealt with, and certainly problems around one's own emotional health is kind of talked about, analyzed, and sometimes treated. So the emotional part of a human being's arsenal, the emotion part, how strong are you emotionally, how do you manage emotion, is an accepted issue that from a very early age is looked at in various forms so that it's managed properly. So when a child cries, you soothe him. When a person comes back from school with a bad set of results, you kind of console him. So the emotional part is there, exists, everybody understands it's an important part, and there is a realization and acceptance that has to be nurtured and grown well. Then I come to the IQ part, the intelligence part. Now, I mean, I'm going to take an easy way out on this and say it's not just the IQ, but it's just your knowledge, in the sense that a lot of effort is spent on educating people, on making them read, making them see the world, making them become knowledgeable. So the combination of your emotional health and the combination of your knowledge health, as in how much knowledge you have, is usually the two basic sets of weapons that you have when you go to the outside world, right? But nowhere when you go into that outside world, and very often after entering the outside world as well, do you then look at the other aspect, which is the cultural aspect, the cultural quotient. Why? Because in our conditioning, it has never happened. In our conditioning, we have only looked at emotional issues and knowledge and intelligence issues. We have not looked at cultural issues. So, which is why I think nations, communities, people, religions fail to come to any common understanding because we are not tuned to think like that. And that is why the universities that I teach in are increasingly bringing in cultural intelligence as part of mainstream learning, right? Now, I'll give you an example of this. I live in Dubai, right? Dubai is home to me. I've lived in Dubai for the last 16 years. Now, I don't know how many of you have been to Dubai and what your views on Dubai is, but I'll also only tell you one thing, that there is a very good reason why Dubai has been successful. And one of the biggest reasons why Dubai has been successful and it keeps attracting more and more people to go and live there and work there is that it has truly become a cultural melting pot. All kinds of people from all over the world have managed to come and live there, make a living there, and live peacefully there. Now, there is criticism on it, there is views on it, I'm not getting there, but that's a fact. And the reason I'm citing Dubai is that I was talking to an Emirati person, a local person. And as you may know or may not know, less than 10% of people who live in Dubai are actually Emiratis, as in local. So 90% of the people are foreigners, and the 10% are the Emiratis. But I have never seen the Emiratis behave poorly or being aggressive with the foreigners or taking advantage against the foreigners. Even when you go to a government department and you queue up, you don't see an Emirati expecting certain privileges because he or she is an Emirati. So I asked this Emirati lady once, what is his story here? And she said something which amazed me. She said from school, they have a subject about how to understand and behave with foreign people. So somewhere in the leadership of Dubai, they realized that our people have to be able to interact, understand, relate to foreigners because we do depend on the foreigners for our prosperity. And that's how I think we should be moving forward in the academia world, in the professional world, in the political world, that how do we bring in that third dimension, the emotion, intelligence, and the culture part. And if we can do that, we will become a better race to live on this earth.
Okay. Thank you so much. We have questions from Veli Nicholas Benta. She placed a question in the chat, but would you like to speak, Veli?
It was just, hi, good morning. Thank you very much, Dr. Mr. Sanjeev Gupta. Quite an enlightening conversation, especially the aspect of emotional intelligence and cultural intelligence. My observation is that much of what he spoke about in his presentation echoed the sentiments of Dr. Plews, who had a recent lecture captioned Intercultural Journeys, that kind of thing. And one of the things that he really spoke about was the way in which we must learn to empathize, step into another person's shoes, another culture's shoes, to really understand, to really have our pulse on the finger to register how the people think wherever we travel. And I think being able to do that, as Mr. Gupta said, is a way of really learning to be tolerant and to become more accepting of others. And in this way, we can it can be mutually beneficial to both parties. And so I really appreciated the conversation. It's really down to earth and very practicable. It's something that every one of us can adopt and adapt in our lifestyle as we go forward. And one of the things that Dr. Plews spoke about, which connects to what Dr. Gupta says, is the concept of deterritorializing ourselves, like moving away from our original roots to really understand. Is a sort of rhizomatic kind of movement going on in the world globally. Everybody is traveling back and forth, and we all depend on each other. It's a lot of interdependence taking place. And so in order for the interdependence to really be successful, mutually beneficial, both parties, everybody in the game has to learn to be culturally aware, culturally educated, to really move forward in this global economy that we're experiencing at the moment.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much. Do you have a comment, Sanjeev?
Yeah, if I may, and thank you very much for sharing that. I'm going to try and read that book as well. But I think what you said is exactly reflective of what I was trying to say, that increasingly people are getting aware of the lacuna, if you want to call it that, in how we are educated, trained, and therefore operate. And one of the biggest lacunas is this whole big world of cultural and tradition and understanding of other people. Now, the only point I'll make quickly is that, you know, in many ways, trying to understand somebody requires a kind of humility in oneself, right?
Yeah.
You know, humility is what leads you to believe that what you know is not the only thing to know in this world, and what you know is not necessarily what everybody knows, and what you think is not necessarily correct. So it comes from humility. And if that humility cannot then translate into curiosity, then the one big problem we'll always have, because the point I'm making here is that for us to be culturally smart, we have to listen. And to listen, we have to be humble, to believe that listening is required. But to be humble, you have to have a self-realization in you that who am I? Why am I not reacting well to global events? So why am I not getting things done the way I want it to happen? I mean, an ex-boss of mine once said this very, very classically when we were having a problem with a transaction. And he said, you know, Sanjeev, the biggest problem we have is, why can't everybody be just like us? Then we wouldn't have a problem. So we do have that phenomenon in us. So the point I'm making here, and we can thrash around this a little more, is the biggest awareness and understanding that we need to have is about ourselves. How do we train ourselves to look deep within ourselves and say, what do I stand for? What are my values? what are my cores and what are my strengths? Because remember, in every human being, there is a core, and that core is largely got to be what you are. But it's about understanding that core and then seeing the periphery around it and saying, are these peripheral issues my core, or are they elastic enough for them to be broadened so that greater assimilation of other understandings can come into it? So I go back to the one point I wanted to make through what I was saying, is that the biggest challenge we have is understanding ourselves. And if we cannot train ourselves to understand ourselves, we will not be able to understand others.
Yes. Very important. Very important. I have another question from Carrie Ann Pierce, or was it a comment? Carrie Ann, you wanted to comment? We will come to Beulah Mitchell right after Carrie Ann makes her point or comments. You had a comment? Okay. So we move on to Beulah.
Sorry.
No,
Are
Carrie,
you
right?
calling me, Carrie Ann?
Yes.
Oh, I
Yes.
wasn't sure if there was another Carrie Ann on here because
And I
sometimes.
said Carrie Ann Pierce.
Oh,
Yes.
okay. Sorry, I didn't hear that. Hi. Thanks so much. I love the presentation, Mr. Gupta. This is a space I operate in on a daily basis as well. And I just giving you kudos because it is so real about the levels of ignorance that people have, particularly where I am now in the US. And to work with them, I'm constantly having to teach the EQ and teach them CQ before we can get any sort of work done. So I'm really grateful for your presence.
Why don't you share a bit of that? It will be nice to hear one or two real life examples from you.
Sure. So I dance between psychology and public health. So I do a lot of health systems work and negotiation with public health professionals and medical providers, and how they're serving communities that are quote unquote tagged as underserved or underprivileged, whether it be international communities or local communities that are under-resourced. And having them understand from that perspective of humility that not everybody is starting with the same starting block at the same starting point. Not everybody is oriented to wellness or resourcing in the same ways they have been as quote unquote professionals, and having them understand that a lot of people's behaviors are also culturally and linguistically defined. It is how we experience things. As you said, growing up in India, you experience things in one way, and it wasn't until you were exposed to something else that you then navigated differently. And it's the same way with the professionals I work here. I always have to expose them to something else for them to understand how to navigate differently with the communities that they're so-called serving. Otherwise, you do an ultimate disservice. So I have to bring in that cultural piece all the time for folks.
Yeah, the problem is rampant, right? I mean, and because of globalization, it's manifesting itself. In the past, we could hide it.
Absolutely. And it is it's insidious, the ways that people are comfortable in their ignorance. So
ignorance is bliss. Remember, ignorance is bliss.
Yes. So I always have to kind of take it back and then bring them up from a different perspective and lens. So kudos to you for your work, and thank you so much for this presentation. I absolutely geeked out on all of it.
That's so kind of you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Beulah Mitchell is the next hand I see raised.
Yes, good morning, colleagues. I wanted to ask, so far we've been hearing, in my view, the positives to cultural intelligence mostly, and I was wondering whether there is any way that this cultural intelligence can be weaponized, in that it can be used to manipulate and abuse or take advantage of. And if so, what are the red flags and the ways by which we could guard against, protect?
Wow. Okay. This is a fascinating thought that you brought to bear here, and I hope I'm not going to sound glib when I try and answer it, because I've never really thought of it the way you posed the question. Because I have always believed that understanding other people is an advantage, and it's good for the world. But then the way you put it makes me think that it's also a weapon, right? And I think I kind of inadvertently probably said that as well when I said that it works for me.
Yes.
So when I take the trouble of understanding people and listening to people and trying to see which levels of fear, greed, or guilt they operate in, I'm essentially creating a weapon for myself. So I think guilty as charged, in the sense your question actually makes me realize that there is a weaponization of this. So that's admitted. But then, having said that, I think maybe the glib answer to that would be that human beings, by definition, or societies by definition for that matter, will always seek betterment for themselves at the cost of others, right? The human race is not just a race in a collective sense, but it's also a race in a competitive sense. That human beings do not operate well unless they can compete, right? At every level, from the time they grew up. Even a baby will fight for an extra piece of food or an extra bit of milk as opposed to his or her sibling. So competition is and getting the better of people around us is a fundamental trait that I believe human beings have, or animals have. So given that scenario, obviously cultural intelligence, or your ability to understand other cultures, is a weapon. You will use it to advance yourself. But then if you can truly make it a science as opposed to being something that some people have and some people don't, and if it can be mainstreamed into our learning, then I think it's a bit like the nuclear war. Everybody will have the nuclear weapon, so nobody will use it unfairly. So I think currently, yes, the more, let's call it aware people, or the more emancipated people, are probably using culture and will use cultural understanding as a way of advancement. But as you bring it more and more into mainstream education, into our collective consciousness, it just becomes part of who we are, what we are. And that, I think, can only lead to goodness and not badness.
That is key.
Yeah, I mean,
Thank you.
just a thought.
Thank you.
Stephen?
Okay, I mean, the sister, Beulah was her name, that
Yes.
brought up the point of weaponizing cultural intelligence. The thing that comes to mind, you see, I'm thinking that where we are today, we have to do a little bit of an assessment post-colonialism, because when you're talking about culture, right? A lot of identity has been forgotten still as a result of colonialism. And then what we have had is a re-identification of oneself based on the new narrative that the colonists essentially has imposed upon on the populations of those of which the resources were extracted. I understand the innate nature of competition that Mr. Gupta has referred to. However, as it pertains to the issue of what the sister was talking about, the negative side of cultural intelligence, where one party tend to impose its identity upon another, irrespective of that if that new identity is not organic to the party that is being imposed upon, then isn't that essentially a cultural quagmire that has been created there that needs to be like unraveled and then reprogrammed, so to speak? Because colonialism has done that to a wide swath of society, and we're still clawing back from that. The fact that there are still conversations taking place where you're from, Professor, and where we're from, particularly also, we're talking about reparative justice to repair some of the harms that took place, which were not necessarily only economical or political, but a great deal of it was also cultural, where people's identity was stripped from them. And that's what we're struggling with today, as a matter of fact. So that's something that the sister brought up on that I wish for you to expand upon, because we cannot have a conversation prescriptively about how do we recreate ourselves without first exercising some of the colonial vestiges that have been imposed upon us that we have not exercised completely. If you understand my point.
I think I do, and if I don't, then please do say so. But I think let's just put a couple of thoughts to the table here. One is that colonization and its effect is what large parts of the world still are dealing with, right? And to a very, very large extent, our generation, and maybe it'll disappear with the next generation a little bit, but certainly my generation has either seen colonization or are children of parents who have seen colonization, and therefore a lot of our growing up, our education, our conditioning, our history, for that matter, the way we have been taught, the way we have been told, has had a very direct impact from colonization, right?
Right.
I mean, it's only now that even in India, it's only now that I see some textbooks, the choice of reading that was received as a given is being questioned, and people are saying that some of these readings, some of these slants, some of these directions are really not how we should be educating our future kids. So yes, you're right that a lot of our realities today is really still, even though we have all become politically independent and celebrate our independence days, is we are still very dependent, because that's there in our DNA.
Well,
having said that, yeah, sorry.
No, I am agreeing with you. However, what I'm saying, yes.
No, carry on, Stephen, please.
I guess what I'm speaking to specifically are the institutions that have undermined the colonized, of which we're still clawing back, so to speak. Because, for instance, right, I live in Central Florida, and the governor here last week, at the behest of the Department of Education, came up with new standards that essentially is teaching that they're teaching this in 2023. It's a standard for the new middle school year coming up. They will be teaching in middle school this year that slaves during slavery in the United States parlayed skills. So essentially, they're saying that slavery was an internship. This is something that the Department of Education in 2023, just last week, today's the 27th, we're talking about, this came out on the 24th. I think the vice president, who happens to be of Jamaican heritage and obviously a person of color, has created a major pushback against this. Now, two things I want to point out here. The Department of Education committee that put this instrument of the revision of history that are going to be taught in the standards going forward, it was done by a committee whereby all the white members of the committee were present, and so consensus was done with them, with the exclusion exclusively of the African American members of the committee. See my point? I'm talking about, this is happening in real time, where against the idea that in the United States of America, African peoples who are coming into their sense of identity relative to the Holocaust that they have experienced are now re-identifying themselves and removing the vestiges of that identity that was imposed upon them. And I'm saying to you that in real time, it's happening right now, where there are states who are looking to revise the curriculum just in order to keep a cultural identity away from a people, and at the same time to, I guess, to revise the history of wanting to have the colonizers' mentality still sanitized in the 21st century. And we're talking about something that occurred 500 years ago, that the perpetrators of that cultural appropriation, so to speak, or cultural castigation, is still seeking today avenues in which to carry on neocolonialism. So, to your point, that everyone now has independence, but the institutions that control us, it's now neocolonial. You understand? Because right here in Florida, as I said, we are actually having to be subject to ahistorical and revisionist history standards in the States today. And that's a part of neocolonialism that I'm speaking of. And it's very disconcerting for people of African descent here in Central Florida. So as a matter of fact, it's most discouraging. So I'm just speaking to that point relative to all that you're speaking on today. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks for that, Stephen. Thank you very much. I don't know if you have a comment, Sanjeev.
No, I mean, I don't want to really continue in the sense of having a debate on this, because I buy into a lot of what Stephen said. And the only point I'll make is that, people don't give up power easily, and people will always perpetuate what works for them. So if any sleight of hand or any historical fact being clouded with different perceptions helps that cause, people will do it. I mean, so it's for us to understand the dynamics at play and do something about it. And I'll just give you one example of that quickly. That, if you believe that colonization effectively started as a direct result of greed, right? If you kind of build that into your thinking, that greed is what led to people going and invading other parts and subjugating other people, then there is an opportunity today for us, the ex-colonized people that we all are, I think. Because, the funny part is the vast majority of the world today have actually been colonized. The colonizers are a minority, right? And so therefore, the one quick point I want to make is that you can turn it around. Like in the African context, for example, one of the things I try to do is to tell the ex-colonizers, who are essentially the wealthy nations, that do not invest in Africa because of guilt, because the greed was replaced with a bit of guilt and a bit of fear. Fear being, if I don't do anything, God knows what will happen. And guilt because, oh God, what have I done? So therefore, let me redeem it. So I kind of go back to them and say, no, don't do anything in Africa for fear and greed. Go back to your greed. Sorry, don't go back. Don't do it for guilt and fear. Go back to your original ethos of greed. And because you have been greedy in the past, remain greedy. But look at Africa as an opportunity for you to become richer. So I play it on a different basis. I say, you need food security, invest in Africa. You need energy security, invest in Africa. You need critical minerals to build batteries to charge your electric cars, invest in Africa. So I played on the other basis, saying, don't change, guys. Continue with your ethos of greed. But because of greed, look at us as a solution to your greed, as opposed to a guilt that you're trying to get rid of. So there are various ways of playing this game.
Yeah, yes. That is so, phenomenal. That is interesting. I really and truly enjoyed this lecture, this conversation, this global conversation. And I really enjoyed the engagement. I thank everybody who came, everybody who participated. But I really want to thank Sanjeev Gupta, our speaker today. I took away several things. And one of the biggest things was that as people, as human beings on this earth, all of us want the four main things: peace, prosperity, security, and hope. Can you imagine that? Basic. When you look at it, basic need all of us want: peace, prosperity, security, and hope. The other thing is that thing that you pointed out in engaging with your business partners and all these countries and so on. You have recognized that there are just three motivators in that space. The three motivators that came back to you not so long ago through I think it was Beulah, who said, can it be used negatively? When you look at those three things: fear, greed, and guilt. Because all of us feel it, but how can we manipulate those three things to get what we want, or get the outcome we want, rather? And then the other thing was humility. It comes back to humility. How do we try to understand people? How do we have to do that through understanding ourselves and looking within before we can look outward to understand others. And it takes a level of humility. Sanjeev, this was excellent, top notch. I want to thank you so much for spending the time with us. I want to thank everybody who came out and just listened or asked questions or made comments. We had a very diverse gathering. We had people coming in and coming out constantly. Excellent. I really enjoyed this. So thank you, everyone. Thank you very much. We have another lecture next month in August. And at that time, we will have our ambassador, June Suma, ambassador to St. Lucia. And she will be presenting on another topic, just as engaging. And we look forward to that. And we will send out our notices as usual and invite you back. But we thank you so much, Sanjeev. This was excellent. Have a wonderful rest of the week, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Really appreciate it. And thanks for sharing some of your thoughts, which, as you can imagine, is enriching for me as well. It's part of my own edification. So thank you for that.
And I'm sure the virtual space wasn't as bad as you kind of feared, because you got quite a bit of engagement. Of course, nothing can replace that in-person interaction and feel, because you actually get to see faces and you kind of gauge how people are feeling while you present. So we thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much again. All the very best to all of you. Okay.
Thank you very much. Okay, bye.
On October 3rd, 1948, months after the establishment of a branch of the University of London to serve British colonies, including an extramural department, then the University College of the West Indies, the first campus officially opened in Mona, Jamaica. 10 women and 23 men from across the Caribbean enrolled to study medicine. Later that year, through royal charter, the university was formally approved by the Privy Council. It has been rendered as a place of light, liberty, and learning, as well as a Caribbean response to the challenge of change by Sir Philip Sherlock, the first Director of Extramural Studies, and Professor Rex Nettleford, the first UWI alumnus to become Vice-Chancellor, in their joint monograph documenting the university's history. 75 years ago, what began as a fledgling university campus in Jamaica has evolved into a future-driven and top-ranked global academy with 5 campuses across the Caribbean and global centers in North and Latin America, Asia, Africa, and Europe.
We are rich in innovations and ideas. We are powerful pelicans, ready to fly on those wings of change like never before.
We are renowned for an exceptional record of producing critical thinkers and leaders who serve the needs of the 21st century society, and at 75, we're just hitting our stride.
UWI's legacy is the light of stellar service and leadership in the Caribbean for 7.5 decades.
A global university rooted in the Caribbean, activist, SDG engaged, climate smart, and championing reparatory justice with a mission to advance learning, create knowledge, and foster innovation for the positive transformation of the Caribbean and the wider world. As we mark our 75th anniversary in 2023, the UE at 75 Jubilee supports a reflection of our past, homage to the present, and the future outlook.
And so we have to be robust in our management, we have to be strategic in our decision making, and we have to ensure that this university continues to rise and to make proud the people of the Caribbean.
We are rooted. Although our growth and impact continues to be global, we remain strongly influenced by where our university's foundation was built and by our service to Caribbean people and their contributions to the UE's development. We are ready. We continue to be an advocate for the region, its needs and advancement, and we are recognized as a valuable resource for expertise on every issue that it faces, playing an unprecedented role in enabling the Caribbean's readiness, ability to overcome challenges, to build the Caribbean's resilience, and revitalize Caribbean development. We are rising. We face head-on with realness and honesty the reality that there is still room for the university to grow. We are on a continuous path of improvement and development, and as the light rising from the west, we aspire to rise, to soar higher, and to be a beacon of empowerment to our community. Rooted, ready, rising. Join us for the 75th anniversary of the University of the West Indies. Learn more at www.uwi.edu/75.
The 75th anniversary of the university, 2023, will be a magnificent year.